Right, well, greetings, everybody. Greetings, viewers. Welcome to another edition of Then, Now and the Future, with myself and Marcus discussing the past, but making it as relevant as we can, and just providing people with some insights from people who were there to varying degrees. So, Marcus, do you want to introduce today's topic?
Well, we're heading into the 60s today, and let's start with that very famous quote of the 60s that if you remember the 60s, you weren't really there. It was a time of massive social change.
Yeah. I mean, I was born in 65, and then by the time I was a teenager, right in the mid to late 70s, that culture was there. It was still there, and it was still a very strong influence, and certainly sort of groups that I moved in at one stage were looking back to that and that whole experience, if you like, something like that.
The 50s were the post-war years, so I guess that was a period of regrouping and recovery. The 60s started a decade that was really based around people's freedom, and for many people that started with music. And although its origins were in the late 50s, rock and roll, I guess, didn't gather speed until the early 60s, and that was a complete musical revelation that also, I guess, kick-started a social revolution alongside of it.
Yes, it's an interesting question, is that to what extent music creates a social movement, or a social movement produces music. Well,
isn't it a case that people tend to follow what their heroes do? So the 60s are synonymous with drugs.
Yes,
many of the pop stars of the time were into drugs, and I guess free love and the hippie movement. It was only natural, I guess, for people to follow the lead of what their new musical icons were doing.
Yeah. So it was a period of breaking norms, breaking barriers. So it's this sense of people were sort of somehow felt constricted, and sort of breaking out of that.
But certainly throwing off the shackles.
That was the idea, wasn't it? And so we were talking a bit last time about the prosperity of the 50s. That there was these post-war booms in what we've called the West. Developed economies, industrial economies. And this means that there was a huge amount of disposable income, and I think that was unprecedented, perhaps, at the same time as the communication, the increased communication and mobility and so on. And so people were exploring this whole idea of freedom, and they realized they could push, that maybe limits they thought existed that didn't 100% absolutely exist. You could push them. And I think people took it right out to the limits, and perhaps got into trouble as well.
Yeah. It was a time of hysteria as well, because, that was the time of the Beatles. And
yes.
If you look back at any of the films of the Beatles on the stage,
yes,
you couldn't actually hear what they were singing, because the screaming and the hysteria that was going on around them.
Yeah.
Massive hysteria around them and the Rolling Stones and lots of other groups.
Yes.
And I guess it was also it was the time of Woodstock.
Yes.
Concert, the origins, I suppose, of massive gigs and concerts. And,
yes.
That was heavily linked with drugs, LSD and the like, and people sort of tripping out.
Yes.
Hippies, the whole hippie movement was into free expression, free love, and coupled, I guess, with the rise of Mary Quant and the miniskirts, which were, I remember going into work one day, and one of the women was wearing a skirt that was probably no wider than a belt.
Yeah,
and yeah, pushing the boundaries was what
well,
was
definitely, yeah. So since then, it's been like, I don't know, deciding what from that you could keep, what was useful, picking up the pieces a bit from what was, but very interesting, isn't it? The whole energy of this music.
Yeah, and for me, it was driving the social change, because the music, was about free expression.
Yeah.
Rock and roll was a complete release, wasn't it, of expression. Before that you had the sedate crooners and
Yes.
band stuff.
Yeah.
And then you've got this frenzy of rock and roll, and people like Little Richard and Chuck Berry.
Yes.
Wow, just completely pushing the boundaries.
Yes, and then and the sort of and then after that we had this progress to real extreme. I mean, the whole world of music, popular music, or the music that's come from rock and roll, if you like. I mean, you have a sort of mainstream, but you have some really extreme versions of metal, these death metal, I don't know what, which is like incredibly like a negative energy in that.
Yeah.
And then but all sorts of amazing things. I mean, amazing musical talent that was also there. That you see some brilliant artistry came out at the same time.
But it's no surprise if it was pushing those boundaries, but it was also pushing social boundaries, because the whole feminism movement has its sort of birthplace, I suppose, in the 60s. So you have the rise of feminism, which was, again, unheard of, women demanding and standing up for their rights. And you had, I think for the first time ever, women workers at the Ford factory going on strike for equal pay with their men counterparts.
Right, yes.
So again, another sea change in the whole social fabric of what was going on. It was a time of tremendous change, socially and technologically, as well as in the music scene.
Yes. I mean, that's it. So the accelerating 20th century, wasn't it? And I think, I don't know. I mean, I just have this sense that maybe but that was the period for me, when the 60s and 70s, when the most creative music came out, and I haven't really since then. No, I don't think there were new styles or things which were fun or whatever, but I mean, what I would call progressive rock, that kind of thing. There's some amazing sounds were produced then.
Well, there's many people who say that it was that creative because many of the artists were high.
Yeah, sure. That's right. So it's another question of what the deeper significance of that is. So I mean, I would say from a sort of theological point of view, that it was pushing limits, but limits from which you have to come back. So somehow maybe it was necessary for humanity to do that. But actually, if you look at the individual stories of it, it was often tragic. And there are lessons to be learned from that, what it did to people.
Yeah. So talk to me about the lessons that you think need to be learned. Have we learned those lessons?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? To some extent. I mean, I think the complete wildness, I think, narcotics have sort of become less mainstream. I think there was a time when they were more respectable. than they are, but now they're sort of widely used, but don't quite have the status that they had back then. So that you could say that's one lesson that's learned to some extent. But I'd say there's a lot of lessons. I mean, you know, for me personally, my path, that was my teenage culture. And, you know, I moved on to something completely different over the years. So I still, you know, occasionally listen to this stuff, but I don't feel so good about it. It's like the Pied Piper, you know, it's a pleasant experience, but I always ask myself, well, what benefit to my soul is that? So I really 180. I mean, I basically, I see what we need is an ascetic approach to life. You know, not a complete self-indulgence, but in fact, complete self-denial is the true principle. So yeah, to answer your question.
So we talk about the growing freedom, particularly for women, and I guess another aspect of that was that the contraceptive pill became freely available in the 60s. So again, another massive step forward for women in terms of their freedom of choice, freedom of activity.
Yes, so definitely, so totally changed society, I would say that. And again, looking on the negative side, if you like, I think, you know, it's sort of creating or tending towards a lack of responsibility in relationships. You know, the idea, I mean, coming back to the idea of free love, you know, free relationships, and I think, and a lot of people would have experimented with that, but then thought, well, just a minute, you know, the point of the permanence of relationships, and so, you know, I think you can protect the permanence of relationship, but you can also abuse it with this. What's the word? Technical advance or whatever it is.
Yeah, indeed. I watch a program on TV called Long Lost Families.
Yes.
Where they help trace children who were given up for adoption.
Right.
Now, many of those, you know, sort of predate, I guess, the 60s and possibly the 50s, and you've got terribly sad stories of women who were forced to give up their babies that they wanted to keep.
Really?
Because, you know, at the time, if you go back to the late 40s, early 50s, you know, the shame of having a baby out of wedlock was huge, was enormous. And you've got these women who, in some cases, looked after their babies for a couple of weeks, or maybe only even an hour or so. And then literally had them snatched away by social services and the like, and given up for adoption because they weren't married and their parents.
Really, simply on that basis.
Absolutely. So horrific stories, and that stay with them all of their lives, and they're now people in their, you know, in their 60s, looking to track down children that they've given up, that they have never forgotten, have thought about. And in many cases they manage to reunite them. And it's heart-wrenching stuff. And, you know, I understand the point of view about, you know, it weakens the whole concept of relationships if you're able to have, you know, sort of, you know, free, easy and safe sex. But on the other hand, there's some very tragic stories that sit behind what happened previous to that.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, what can we say? I mean, you know, things could have been different, I suppose, in every sense. But I think, it can be used to strengthen a relationship, can't it? I mean, it takes the pressure off, you know, having a very large family and so on. So I think, it's how you use it, isn't it? That's the question.
Well, that's right. I've been looking back through my family tree and sort of horrified at the number of children my ancestors had. You know, sort of 7, 8, 9 children. The women were of the day were just like sort of machines churning out children.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm certainly not against having large families, but it sometimes it depends a lot on circumstances, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, it needs to be planned as opposed to the natural result of the act, I suppose. So we've got a little bit deep there in
that was went down that road.
in terms of the social stuff, but the rise of colour TV and pocket transistor radio.
Oh, right. Okay. Now I do.
You can take your music on the move.
Yeah. Do you remember a TV program called Marine Boy? Do you remember that one?
No, I don't.
It was a children's one, and I get he was a boy who swam around under the sea. I remember seeing that in colour for the first time. I think the neighbours, we had a black and white telly, and the neighbours had a colour. I went to see it there.
I remember, I distinctly remember us getting our first colour TV. We lived in North London, and I think I mentioned to you, my parents ran a grocery shop. They had to give it up because of the rise of the new supermarkets, which just sort of destroyed the trade. Yeah. But they own the property, so they leased it out to a TV company called Radio Rentals. So we
definitely, that was still around.
Yeah, we lived above a radio rental shop, and we got our first colour TV. And I remember the guy coming up to our sort of like masonette type thing. We were on a couple of floors of the shop, and fixing up the colour TV in the lounge. And wow, just absolutely amazed at at this vision.
That's right. And now it's ever more high definition plasma TVs, isn't it? It's like the home cinema is becoming more and more highly developed. Although I have to confess to being an exception to that. We don't even have a television in our house.
Really? Oh well, okay.
So we just seem to keep ourselves occupied without one. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm absolutely in principle opposed to having a television, but I do have issues about generally the way they're used, being on all the time, and the kind of information and input into household life that's coming through them if they're just there going all the time. But I suppose
it's quantity, not quality, a lot of the time.
Well, that's right. So I mean, occasionally it would be nice to watch something, in high definition on a big screen, but so far I haven't felt so strongly about that.
Okay, I guess that we can't leave the 60s without touching on one of the most controversial things, and that was the moon landings.
Oh, you're going to bring me out on that, are you?
I am.
I was hoping I could stay.
Well, it was, and I guess still is, one of the most controversial of events from the 60s.
Yeah, well, certainly this is one of my first memories, is the newspaper with the picture of Neil Armstrong on the front. So there you go. That is, I can remember that very clearly. But I don't believe it. I don't believe it happened. So there you go. I don't want to. I mean, I think everybody has an opinion one way or another about this. It's
hard to. I have to admit, it is hard to believe with the technology they had at the time that they could actually do that. I'd love to believe that it was true, but I have to say I struggle.
I mean, to me, it doesn't bear examination. If you start looking at it, it's just, but anybody, I don't think we need to go in much detail about it, because there's so much information. People can watch any video with one side of the argument or the other.
Absolutely, and it would be good if any of our viewers who've stuck with us let us have their views on that. And I guess one of the things we touched on briefly before we started the recording was another major social event of the time, a political event, and that was the Profumo affair.
Yes, yes.
So he was foreign secretary. He had an affair with a cool girl called Christine Keeler, who was also seeing a Russian diplomat. He denied that he was having the affair. He lied in the House of Commons and subsequently had to resign. If you read the social texts of the time, I think what they're saying is that it changed the relationship of politicians with the public. It changed the public's view of politicians from one of esteem, I guess, to one of mistrust. You know, if a senior politician can lie to the House of Commons, to what extent can you trust politicians? And I think,
right. So you would say, in your earliest experience, or that of your parents, that there was a widespread trust of politicians?
Yeah, I certainly think they were held. They were statesmen, a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you look at someone like Churchill and say he was a statesman.
Right,
I don't think there's very many politicians, if any, of the current range of politicians
yes.
that we've had now and over, you know, the last decade or so, where you could say they were statesmen.
Yes.
People would resign on points of principle. People would, you know, if they did something wrong, would say, "My fault, sorry, you know, here's my resignation."
Yes.
Now they've got to be dragged kicking and screaming up the door, constantly denying that it's not their fault, it was somebody else's fault. So yes, I think, you know, there has been a definite change.
Yeah, so people just got used to that kind of level of quality, I suppose, of the people in the political scene.
Yeah, so it's difficult to know whether, I mean, people are people, aren't they? And politicians at the end of the day are people. So you'll always get good people and bad people.
Yes.
But I think there's certainly been a change in the relationship between, you know, the public and the way they view politicians.
Yes.
And, you know, social commentators put that down to having its origins round about the time of Profumo. So, you know, regardless of, you know, the details of what went on, and I remember sort of in the, you know, in the late 60s, I just started work, and I was a copy boy on a news agency. So, you know, I'm, yeah, the office junior, if you like.
Yes.
And just as a social commentary, and it's got, you know, it's just a story rather than having any real meaning to it. But Hampstead Heath in North London, 200 acres of open space. It's one of the two areas that are known as the hearts of London, Epping Forest and Hampstead Heath, and two massive areas. And it was in the late 60s that a guy was found crucified on Hampstead Heath, properly crucified, hands, you know, nails through his hands and his feet.
Yeah.
And he was put there, I think he was a bit of a religious nut, and he was put there by three guys who were subsequently caught, and they were tried at the Old Bailey, and they were represented by a very high class barrister called David Jacobs. This was the guy who defended Liberace when he was accused of being homosexual. And back then, being homosexual was a criminal offence, and you went to prison for it. So there was a whole controversy about why was this high-class barrister defending these three nobodies who nobody, you know, who were they? Why was he defending them?
Yes.
I remember it because our agency had contacts in all sorts of places, the police, the fire brigade,
Yeah.
the ambulance service. And the driver of the ambulance that was called to take this guy down off the cross was one of our contacts. And before they took him down, he ran off 3 rolls of film for us. There were a lot of money in photos.
Yeah. Yeah.
The agency couldn't sell them in this country, but they could sell them abroad. And so again, as that sticks in my mind simply because when we talk about people like Profumo and the naughty things that were going on, even back then there's a whole undercurrent to civilization that goes on that involves politician and police and the establishment and everybody else. There's this whole undercurrent that as ordinary members of the public we know absolutely nothing about. Everyone is in everyone else's pockets, and that was for me, as I would have been 16 or so. So my very first job, my very first foray into the big wide world, and it was a hell of an eye-opener for me to wow, there's this other world, this other dimension to society that most of us know nothing about.
Well, thank you for that, Marcus. I don't think I knew them. Maybe I had heard of that story, but it's enough for me to be curious. I'm going to look it up afterwards. So yeah, things happened, didn't they? And I think there's probably quite a few stories like that which would
certainly from my days in journalism. But
okay, well, that's a sort of nice way to end, isn't it? A sort of question mark, what was going on, and maybe inspire our viewers with interest
as we look to leap into the 70s for next time.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we have a bit more in the 60s, I don't know, but but certainly the run up to the 70s. Yeah. Okay, well, it's been great to talk.
Yeah, it's been fabulous as always, Peter. Thank you.
Okay. So